Hey guys, I'm Mark from MTM. Today in the workshop we have a Citroen C1 that's in with a failed clutch. The customer's broken down and it's been recovered in. So let's get it on the lift and get that clutch replaced. So first thing is that we'll disconnect the battery, take off negative terminal, just tuck that down there somewhere. Same for the positive. There's another securing bolt down here. This is a 12mm, so when this is loose, this can come up. Now the battery should be insecure and we can move this out of the way. Just get this tray out of the way that holds the battery up. So you're gonna have to take off these little plastic clips, just to make sure that you can disconnect the wiring from them. There's there's 3 10mm that we can see. We'll check if there's anything else. Take these out. So when these two are out, you can undo this 10mm here. So just here, there's a little clip there. We can undo that and we should be able to separate it then from the battery carrier. There's another 10mm here holding the other side of this box. It should lift up. There you go. These tabs to disconnect the wiring from that plate. I'm not sure if you can see, but there's another bolt just down there and it's a 12mm. So just feed this down. This should come out. There's a cable stuck just the back here. There you go, that's out. So you can grab all your bolts, make sure they're all together. Okay, so now that the battery and the battery tray is off, we can put this up in the air, take the wheels off and start doing everything from underneath. So with the car up in the air, we're going to want to take out both front drive shafts. So before we do that, we want to drain the gear oil. And there's a drain plug just here that we can use to drain all of that out and then start stripping off the drive shafts. So this bolt just here is a 24mm. Just crack that off. Nice. This looks like it was due a good change. And then when that's finished draining, put the drain plug back in. Make sure it's tight. A bit of wipe. So in order to take the drive shaft out of the gearbox, we have to disconnect it from the hub assembly. It's held onto the hub assembly by this multi-splined nut. So this is a 30mm. We can just gun this off. And it's here when we can usually tell how free it is. Oh, nice. So that can move back and forth inside the hub assembly, meaning that this drive shaft will be able to come out nice and freely. Now that nut is off and this is nice and free, the only thing we have to do is undo the bottom ball joint nut so that we can take the wishbone away, just so we can move the hub assembly far enough away in order to get the drive shaft out of this whole assembly. Then when that's done, we can separate it from the actual gearbox. So to disconnect the bottom ball joint, you want to take out this little circlip or this little pin. So you want to unhook it from the nut. Just pull it out. And don't drop it like I just did. Then to undo this nut, you want a 19 and a spanner extender. Love this thing. Once it's broken off, you can work it off by hand. And we need to undo the anti-roll bar link. The bush off. There you go. Because we need to reuse this wishbone arm, we can't just put a separator tool because that'll damage the dust cover. So if we give where the actual taper goes through, if we give that a hit with a hammer, it should hopefully shock the metal enough so that it can release it so we can pull this wishbone down. There we go. The bushes will release from the top side of the anti-roll bar link as well, so make sure you keep them safe. So then with everything loose and the bottom detached, we can push through that drive shaft, grab it from the back and then guide the whole hub away from it. You want to be careful that you don't damage the ABS sensor where it pops through on the other side as well. There you go. Now that's free, we can just set that back where it was. So where the drive shaft goes into the gearbox, the housing around it can be quite brittle. So if you put a pry bar in, you can very easily damage, especially these really thin parts. So you want to find just a surface where you can press against and see where you can lever it. There we go, that's popped out. And guide it gently away from the seal. There we go, and that's the drive shaft out. And the process is exactly the same for the other side. It's just the only difference is that the drive shaft on the driver's side is a little bit longer. So with the battery tray out of the way, we can take off these gear cables. These are held in just with that little circlip there, so you might need a little pick. Just lift that out, and then that can come off. Same goes for the one underneath it. And that one can come off. Just here is a 13mm, which holds on the bracket. There's another one just underneath. So you'll have to maneuver the cables a little bit. And you can see here on the clutch fork that if I bring this whole mounting forward enough, I can just disconnect it like that. This will need proper adjusting when we put the box back on though. We can't just put it back on in the same place. So once that's off, you want to tuck these out of the way the best you can. But you'll notice there's another little bracket that's bolted to it that goes onto this wiring loom. So you could just disconnect the little plastic clip up here so that it frees it up so you can push it out of the way. And once it's disconnected from the wiring loom, you can tuck it all the way down there. Then you've got things like the gearbox earth cable. So there's a little 10mm there, or probably a 12 if anything else on the car is ready to go by. And you've got all these other little bits of electrics. And just double check around the gearbox to make sure there's nothing else that's clipped or bolted to it, because you want to make sure everything is completely free before we start undoing the bell housing bolts. There's this electrical connector. So let's disconnect this bracket for the earth cable. Put that bolt back in there just so I know where it goes. Now let's get this lower one for the actual terminal. There you go. With these, it's easier to just put the bolts a few threads back into the hole, just so you know these are the correct places for them. It's very easy to get them confused with other bolts that are on the car. And then we can bring up this earth cable and tuck it out of the way. So now that we're happy that we've cleared the majority of the stuff from around the gearbox, apart from one plug that we can't get until it's up in the air, we can start taking out the bell housing bolts. So we can see a couple here. That one there. There's one a little bit further over. And this little one, which is it's for the starter motor. The other one we'll have to take out from underneath. So let's get all of these out now. Now the car's going to go up in the air, we can get the rest of the bolts out, and we're always going to leave one bell housing bolt in just to make sure that everything is held in place until that box is ready to come out. So with the car back up in the air, here's that electrical connector that we couldn't reach from up top. So let's just disconnect that now. There we go. Just pull it out of this little spring that's on there. This bracket will still have to come off. And this can be pulled up there just so it's out of the way. So with that wiring out of the way, There's one bolt there, one just above it, and the rest are on this side. And from the other side, we can see the other bell housing bolts and that other bolt for the starter. When we disconnect our one, we can just pull the starter out just so it can sit just out of the place where it lives. And then when it's sat there, it won't be in our way when we try to take the box out. The starter is free. And this can just be set back a little bit. So I'm going to take out all of these bell housing bolts apart from one. Okay, so now all of the bell housing bolts are out, apart from one just here, which I'm going to leave in until I'm ready to take the box out. Now I'm going to take off this support arm. So here's the support arm that we're going to be taking off. So we need to unbolt this here, that's a 19mm. This is a 19mm. That then will release the engine, but we're also going to take off these brackets. There we go. Also, thinking about it now, it makes sense to remove this inner wheel arch liner so that this isn't in your way when we're trying to take the box out and put it back in. So these are a couple of 10mm up here. So 10mm here, 10mm there, there. So we'll disconnect this. Hopefully we might just be able to move it out the way rather than take off the whole thing. So now that I have plenty of room down here, I'm going to use a transmission jack to support the weight of the engine so I can take off the gearbox mount. So when I take off the gearbox mount, all of the weight of the engine will be on this transmission jack. So I'll be able to lower it down slowly just so it's at the correct angle for me to take out that last bolt and remove the gearbox. So you want to get your ladder. So now that we're up top, we can take off these four gearbox mount bolts. I'm going to crack them first. You could gun these off. So now this last one, as I work the thread out, I should start to see them lower down. Yeah. So even though now I could lower the engine down and take the gearbox out, I'm still going to have an issue with the actual gear selector. So if I take off the rest of the mounts, only 3 other bolts, I can just make sure I've given myself as much room as possible. The thing is that these are very prone to rust. So there's those 3 bolts out that hold the mount onto the body of the car. The 4 bolts that hold the mount to the actual gearbox are off. So now this is now free. So for safety's sake, I've got another transmission jack just underneath the gearbox in case it were to fall. Then it's not going to fall straight to the floor. This will catch it. So now I can feel there's a little bit of wiggle in the gearbox. As far as I can tell, there's nothing else attached. So we can just work out this last bolt. And then I can lower the engine as needed in order to get the gearbox out. So there's that last bolt out. There are dowels on this, and sometimes they can grab on, make it a little bit difficult to separate. And there we go, she's out. Okay, so we took the gearbox out last night. It is now the next morning. And now let's take a look at this gearbox to see if we can see what's gone wrong. So what we're feeling inside the car when we press the pedal, the cable moves this arm. And we've only got a little bit of movement before it goes really stiff. And it's not far enough for the thrust bearing to then put that pressure onto the clutch. We've got an LUK 3-piece clutch kit, so it comes with a new thrust bearing, new friction plate, pressure plate. So we are good to go. So let's get this changed. So looking at the new one, you can kind of see how it works, how these springs hold on to the fork. And this can just slide off. So we've taken off the old thrust bearing, we've given in here a quick clean down, and looking at that thrust bearing, that side's okay, but this side is broken. And on the fork here, not sure if you can see that little notch, that's where the spring there will sit, as it sits in there. And there's a notch on both sides, so this is locked into place. And just to show you in comparison to how much free movement we have now compared to earlier, miles better. Also, a little tip, these shafts, they do have a tendency to wear inside the gearbox, so you want to give that a little push up and down, side to side, just to feel for any play there. And also so you don't get caught out later on. It's always handy to make sure that this does actually fit onto the shaft. We can fit the clutch to the car and then refit this box. Right, so let's get this clutch off. That should wiggle off the dowels. And we're off. So now that we've got the clutch off, looking at the friction plate, you can see where it's worn. But to be fair, I've seen worse. Main reason for concern would be the pressure plate, the wear marks on these springs, on these fins. So this is where the thrust bearing applies the pressure to this plate, press it up against the friction plate, and in order to engage or disengage the clutch. So with the new clutch kit, you'll notice on the friction plate, it says, just below that, gearbox side. So it's very important which way this goes on. So that gets seated up against there. There's a special tool to align it. So when this goes on and it tightens up, it has to stay in the exact position so that it can line up with the shaft on the gearbox. Line it up best you can. You don't want to do this tool too tight because you want it to have a little bit of adjustment if you need to. But once you're happy that that is all nice and even, that is what it should look like. So now, let's go fit this to the car. So we want to line up the dowels. We have given the flywheel a little clean. So now that we're on the dowels, we can put in the bolts a couple of threads and we'll have to wind it in evenly. There are specific torque settings for these. So we'll wind these in with a gun and then we'll go back around and double check them with a ratchet. Just bring the plier here just to catch the teeth. So now we can undo this tool. And that should be dead straight. Okay, so this next part should be done with 2 people, just for safety reasons. Oh, there we go. Once it's in, put 1 bolt in, just to make sure everything's held in place. So now that the gearbox is back in, the hard part is done, now we just have to reassemble it. So now it's refit everything in the reverse order which it came off. So I'm going to start putting back in those gearbox bolts. Now, as I've said before, it's important to start every bolt by hand, just so you don't damage the thread. Then you can run them up with a ratchet. We can put the starter motor back into position as well. Normally these have a dowel, but it doesn't look like this one has it. So you do have to be careful with how you position it. That, and final tighten it with a ratchet. So now that the bell housing bolts are in underneath, it's ladder time. We'll put the engine mount back in place. Now the engine mount is tight, we can go back downstairs and take away that engine support. So now that the engine is now supported by the gearbox mount, the wiring that we tacked up out of the way earlier. Going to just feed back down into position. Remember the bolts that we put back in the gearbox, just so that we didn't mix them up with anything else. It's these bolts. That goes back in there where it was, and then that goes back into place. While we're down here, we'll put on the bracket for the lower engine support. So at this point, we could have moved straight on to putting the drive shafts back in, but what I want to do first is reconnect the clutch cable to make sure that we have a good pedal before we go any further. But if we refit the bracket that has the gear linkages and the clutch cable, that's going to be in the way then of some of the bolts on the gearbox bell housing. So we'll refit those bolts first, then we'll put on that bracket and see where we are with the clutch. And that's all the bell housing bolts on. Also, it's a little hard to see, but between the starter motor and the bell housing, there's a little black plastic cover that needs to go back on as well. So when you're happy all the bell housing bolts are back in as they should be, you can reconnect the electrical connectors, put the brackets back on, and then position the bracket for the gear cables. So the clutch pedal at this moment in time, I haven't de-adjusted. I'm going to put it back on as it was. Then if I need to do any adjustments, I can do that later. Right now, I just want to make sure that we have a decent pedal. Okay, so we're just refitting the bracket for the gear cables. It's a little bit fiddly, especially because with the slack before you put the bracket on, that's when you should put the clutch cable in. So you're under a little bit of tension when you're doing up the bracket, which isn't ideal. But as I said, if I need to make an adjustment to the cable, it's easier to do when everything is back on. Okay, so I felt the pedal. Pedal feels really good. So now we can finish rebuilding. And so we may as well refit the gear cables. Put those pins back in. Earth strap back fitted to the gearbox. Drive shafts back in. So both front drive shafts are back in. The anti-roll bar links are only hand tight, so I'll tighten them up now. Just tightening up the wishbone arms. So don't forget the pins. So now that everything is back on and tight, we can now refill the gearbox with gear oil. So take out the filler plug, just there, and that's where we fill it. So we filled it up with gear oil. I've put back on this plastic wheel arch laid out with a couple of 10 mils. I'm going to put the wheels back on and then we're going to finish up top. Always torque your wheels. I had to adjust the clutch cable a little bit, but now there is a little bit of slack in that cable, so that's where it should be, just bouncing back. And the pedal is sat right next to where the brake pedal is, so it's in the perfect position. Let's get this back in place. Okay, now the battery. And that is it, we are all done. Now it's time to jump in and take it for a test drive. So we've just got back from road test, everything's fine, she's driving brilliantly, changing up those gears nice. So that is how you go about replacing a clutch in a Citroen C1. So I hope this has helped, guys. If it has, please give us a like on the video, please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. I'll see you in the next one.